Hey there, Cinemaniacs. Welcome back to Den of Sin with Devin and James. We're very excited about tonight's episode. We're happy to have you guys along for this ride. I think that might be overselling the excitement of this podcast, but we're excited to have you anyways. We're excited to have you listen. We have a fun topic tonight that I'm personally really excited about. So with me is obviously my partner in crime, Devin. Devin, how are you doing tonight?
I'm doing all right. Back to work, so life is a little bit different, but still keeping up, and was definitely excited to talk about this week's topic. Would you like to introduce it? Because I think this is one where you're even more, let's say, spiritually connected to some of these films than I am.
Sure. Yeah, so tonight we're going to talk about the films, specifically the 80s output of the Canon Film Group, also previously known as Globus, blanking on the second name, but
Golan, Globus.
There you go. Thank you. But yeah, we're excited. If you're a fan of 80s genre films, then Canon should be well known to you. If not, we're going to get into it. Devin, about 2 hours ago, I was like, I'm going to have multiple shirts. I was going to try to find my Death Wish 3 shirts, my Cobra shirt, my Canon logo t-shirt. And after an hour of looking, my wife is constantly saying that I have too many t-shirts. And I think she might be right. I went through literally an hour of searching for a t-shirt before I was like, I'm just giving up for a t-shirt that only, you would see and I would see. So unfortunately, I couldn't find any of them. But, I do own several shirts from the films that they've put out, and like I said, as well as their logo, because that kind of, again, speaks to the importance of some of the films in their catalog. So, yeah, I'm excited about it. Before we really get into it, what is your history with the films of the Canon films?
Well, I watched a ton of them growing up. I don't think that I was hooked in so much that I really realized until I was maybe a teenager that there was one production company putting all these things out. Growing up, all the logos that pop up before your favorite VHS. And there was obviously Warner Brothers, 20th Century Fox, have famous fanfare, and Canon certainly had theirs. There was Coralco, Orion, all these names. But Canon really sticks out as not the best, but certainly one of the most unique of the companies from that period.
I would say they were the best at what they did.
I'll
and I will say, Canon was important to me as a kid because at the age of like 11 or 12, it was right around the time when I started noticing the film companies, obviously like Full Moon and Troma, even as a kid, I knew their output because they were so very specific at what they did. And they, made sure that their branding was very noticeable.
Especially
but it would get
Troma.
to a point where I would rent a movie. Yeah, exactly. It got to the point where if I would rent a movie and I would see it would come up with the Canon logo, I'd be like, oh shit, this might be good. Even if it was a film I'd never seen before. As soon as I started seeing that Canon logo, I would get excited. And it wasn't, like I said, I wasn't versed enough in film history and stuff to really be that aware of their output. But I do know, I would remember seeing, because as a kid, I'm sure you did the same thing. If I watched a movie, I enjoyed. I watched it over and over and over again to the point where I memorized all the lines. And again, once you start seeing that Canon logo, if you see another film in that same genre, whether it's hard-boiled crime movie or action film or whatever, you were just like, oh shit, this is going to be good because they also did Death Wish 3 or whatever. So which might be a weird distinction for some people, but it was important to me as a kid. But yeah, so I'm really excited. This is a film company that has a very long history. They were putting out films in the 60s and really putting a lot of films out in the 70s and some really good films. But we're going to specifically keep it to the 80s, I think, just because even the 80s, they, like we were discussing right before this podcast started, low budget, production companies like AIP, like Full Moon, even to this day, which is weird to think about, they just churn out movies. They're low budget films and they're trying to churn out as many as possible to really make a profit. So obviously we can't talk about every film from the Canon library because there's just way too many. Only other thing I want to talk about though, before we even start talking about the films, is for the viewers out there is a really great and really entertaining documentary about Canon films, history Canon films. So, like I said, it's a very interesting story, the rise and fall of Canon. So I recommend, if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out, especially if you're a fan of the films that they put out. So a little plug for that. And before I go in, another plug, a completely unpaid plug, but right next to me, I did find my Voltage VHS lamp put out by Voltage VHS, which, full disclosure, are friends of ours who put them out, but they are amazing. They are LED, real old VHS lamps. and they do both blank label and well as literally they'll find like an old, VHS cassette of like, Slaughterhouse. You can get a legit old Slaughterhouse VHS, and it will have the LED lights in it. They have become a little bit more responsible or aware of like the fact that some diehard VHS fans are like, you're ruining a perfectly good copy of this old movie. So they do it now more on like, they try to do them either on blank VHS or more like VHS that are readily available, but still cool. But yeah, check them out. They are on social media, Voltage VHS. I should have been more prepared to give like a URL, but you'll find them, Voltage VHS. Give them a look. Like I said, especially if you're a fan of film, and especially if you're a VHS collector, which if you are, my condolences to you. I know how rough that hobby is. In fact, I pretty much gave it up actively looking for VHS just because it got too cutthroat. But anyways, I want to give them a plug because they do cool stuff. And, it's a really cool addition to your little, if you have your own like little viewing room, your own like mini theater in your home, it's a really cool addition. Just want to give them a little shout out, a little plug if I could.
So they're Devin, a great company and a great couple of guys.
A great couple of guys, yeah. Shout out to Voltage VHS. So I'll let you kick it off. If there's a specific film that you want to talk about, we can do this chronologically if you want. It doesn't. We can keep this as loose as you want. But is there any film that you wanted to talk about specifically?
I'd love to do a deep, comprehensive dive into The Happy Hooker Goes Hollywood.
Okay.
No, I actually don't.
I was like, okay.
The only thing to say about The Happy Hooker Goes Hollywood is that it's the perfect film for anybody out there who's always wished they could find Adam West in a softcore porn.
That's right.
but it is indicative of the type of stuff that Canon Films was putting out prior to the heyday of the 80s. They did a lot of softcore stuff, a lot of Swedish quote-unquote art films. I actually say the quote-unquote non-ironically because they are art films, but that was also their justification at the time. Oh, it's an art film. A lot of them directed by Joseph Sarno, who I was lucky enough to meet once upon a time in New York.
That's awesome.
But in 1979, the company that was known as Canon, that had put out all of these softcore things, was purchased by Israeli cousins Menahem Golan and Yoram Globus, which are still to this day some of the most interesting names in the industry. Yoram Globus is still with us. Unfortunately, Menahem Golan passed away a few years ago. And I think part of what made their dynamic so powerful in the 80s and made them kind of a force to be reckoned with, to where even major critics like Roger Ebert had opinions on them, was because Menahem, in particular, Menahem Golan, he was a writer-director himself. So you look at a lot of these studios, even going back to the original studios, talking about Jack Warner himself and people like that. They weren't filmmakers per se. They were producers, which is a filmmaking role, but they weren't making their own movies and their own vision. Yeah. And Menahem Golan actually was. He was a kind of a force to be reckoned with in Israel. They made a lot of comedies and were really successful and decided to come out to the United States to hit it big. And they bought out Canon Films as their vehicle for doing this. They bought it for $500,000. So when you imagine how much money they ended up making in a very short period of time off of that $500,000 investment, these guys are a force to be reckoned with in 80s film. Like we pointed out, a lot of people have seen their movies. You've probably seen a lot of their advertising as well. They were famous in the 80s for frequently advertising films that they hadn't made yet.
Exactly.
And the consequence of that is that there are a lot of Canon posters for movies that don't exist. You can actually go online, search unproduced Canon films. They had one where Charles Bronson was going to play the Golan, the classic sort of horror story.
Jewish.
Yes. Yep. You'll see alternate sort of things like, well, we'll get to American Ninja later, I'm sure, but originally American Ninja was supposed to be Chuck Norris, and there's an American Ninja poster with Chuck Norris. Yeah. They do have one really big unproduced project, which we'll bring up later. Kind of was one of those films that got away and landed somewhere else and is still successal. But we'll go over that in a little bit.
Yeah,
I think you know which one.
The ending of Canon Groups, like their final demise, is very interesting. Sad and stuff. But we can get in. I will say that old, trade magazines that featured, full page ads for those unproduced Canon films or whatever. I've seen those ads and those, industry posters. I don't know if they're reproductions, whatever, but I know they did a lot of stuff in like, trade industry magazines of like coming soon.
Yes.
And those are very hard to come by.
They get in trouble too. Some of them were illegally posted. Like they lost some of those deals. I think Dustin Hoffman was one of these where they posted that Dustin Hoffman was going to be in a film of theirs. They created the poster, and Dustin Hoffman said, "I didn't agree to this," and pulled out of any kind of deal that they would have possibly have made with Dustin Hoffman.
So, obviously, like there's tons of films, even in the 1980 and early 80s. Is there anyone specifically you want to talk about?
I'm going to give you a choice, and it's not a choice of film; it's a choice of path.
Okay.
Because whatever you choose on this, it's going to inevitably lead to the next thing that we talk about, I'm sure. And one is canon horror, and the other is canon ninjas, which is two genres that they started with.
Well, that's funny that you mentioned that, because I know the first one I actually wanted to talk about, even early in their career, they had some minor hits, especially with horror. But the first movie I wanted to talk about was actually Enter the Ninja trilogy and how important those films were. Sort of really honestly kickstarting the real ninja craze in the United States and really setting a lot of the mythology that a lot of films would follow with ninjas. The sort of, not necessarily historically accurate, but taking a lot of, influence from actual Japanese history with ninjas and adding their cinematic flavor to it. But yeah, I'm down with whatever we're already talking about ninjas, so I guess we can talk about ninjas if you want. Yeah, let's go ahead. Let's talk about ninjas. What do you want to say about the ninjas?
Well, let's start with Enter the Ninja, which is a suspiciously derivative title to begin with.
Yeah.
And it was one that I saw later in life, and it's a lot of fun. But what are your thoughts on it? I
have a soft spot. First off, Sho Kosugi was just a bad motherfucker. Like, he's just the coolest dude. But yeah, they're silly and fun, but especially by the end of the trilogy, it's batshit crazy. But as a kid, 1982, 1983, as a young kid, I loved ninjas. Who didn't love ninjas as a kid? Especially, like, this is pre-Ninja Turtles. This is pre all of that. But even then, this is all those early...
pre those things in the same way that the Big Bang is pre-Earth. Like, this was what... That's right. Made Ninja Turtles possible, things like that.
Exactly. And like I said, single-handedly created a lot of the aesthetic and created a lot of the, the mystic elements of ninja, which obviously is nonsense. But, and again, having Sho Kosugi, be a part of the film, added, because again, America has a long tradition of casting white people in Asian roles, or like the white savior, or they, really kind of cartoonishly portray. I don't mean like Mickey Rooney in fucking Breakfast at Tiffany's level, but I mean even like reducing them to more stereotypes or not giving them really cool, leading roles, whatever. And I will honestly, I was actually just well before we were even going to do this podcast, I've been rewatching a ton of like old kung fu movies and a lot of martial arts movies and a lot of like Japanese samurai films and stuff. But I didn't realize that I don't have a lot of those films. I have Ninja 2 and Ninja 3, but I don't own the original Enter the Ninja, even though I could have sworn I did. And some other old, a lot of the Lone Wolf and Cub movies and stuff too. But I've been wanting to, buy them and rewatch them. But as a kid, there's just the iconography of the ninja. As a kid, I just thought it was the coolest shit ever. I still think it's cool. I mean, ninjas are still, even though they're not like real ninjutsu, had nothing to do with that stuff. But it's still, are they great movies? I mean, I'm not going to argue that point.
No, they're not.
no, they're not. But I mean, they're cool in their own right. And again, historically important because, especially, I actually think that Enter the Ninja 2 is actually, I think, the best of the three. And I think,
damn it, that's the one that I haven't seen.
Yeah, that's definitely the best of the three. Even though I love
that was Revenge of the Ninja was the second one, correct?
Revenge of the Ninja, exactly. Yeah, that poster is still burned in my brain. But yeah, I mean, obviously the ninjas were big for them, well into American Ninja, which I remember not being a fan of growing up, but I actually just rewatched the first one just a couple of weeks ago, maybe a month ago, and it was fun. I mean,
same here.
Yeah, I mean, it is very much of the time. I mean, the first 10 minutes of the first American Ninja is just like so weirdly perfect, and like these dudes are playing like hacky sack or something. Anyway, it's like the weirdest opening to a martial arts movie, but yeah, I mean, they scored big with the ninja stuff, and then they definitely, cornered that market for the American ninja. Not just the movie American Ninjas, but the American films that featured ninja.
Yes. And the first one was Franco Nero was the ninja in Enter the Ninja, the one that everyone was afraid of.
So did you want to did we want to just hop around? Did you want to talk about do it in sequential order, in chronological order? Do you just want to sort of jump? I know there's a film, or the reason I'm asking is because I know there's a film on here in one of the first films released under the CIN label, which I know is a big movie for you. You were the one that showed me this movie. I'm really excited to hear you talk about it because this movie doesn't come up a lot. In fact, I've tried to talk about this movie. As a fan of strange musicals, it's a whole subgenre I adore and I'm a big fan of. So I don't really get to talk about it a lot. And this is definitely one of the most legendary of the genre. So for those that don't know what we're talking about, we are talking about 1980s The Apple. I want to hear you talk about it, Devin.
You ready to do the BIM? The Apple. So many things I could say about The Apple. It was written and directed by Menahem Golan himself, who I believe was actually intending to make a Yiddish musical, and it kind of shaped itself into this. It actually defies explanation in so many ways. It's
absolutely.
It's a Christian allegory in the form of a disco musical, and I guess the people I'd want to side with are on the devil's side. They're so much more interesting than the folk singers.
Yep. I mean, not to get political, but I would say that sort of mirrors real life a little bit.
Yeah. To try my best to put the plot of this movie in a capsule, it is about the Boogaloo International Music Company, the BIM, run by the devilish Mr. Boogaloo.
One of the craziest performances in film history.
Exactly, and that's played by Vladek Scheibel is his name. And the only other thing I've ever seen him in, I believe, was From Russia with Love. He was one of the bad guys coming after Bond in the second Bond.
He can only play bad guys.
Pretty much, but he's so good at it. He's delicious in this movie, let's say.
Oh, he's the best thing about the movie.
He's one of my favorite villains. He's basically the devil, and he's ruling over the futuristic year of 1994. This is 1994 from the perspective of, I believe, 1981.
That's right.
When people were making movies in the early 80s about the future, why didn't they project a little later? I've never quite been able to understand this.
It boggles my mind. I was watching this Japanese tokusatsu, is basically means special effects shows in Japan, but I was watching this one, and it's supposed to be set in the futuristic year of 1999, but the show was released in 1993. I'm like, you thought this shit was going to happen? All this shit was going to happen in 6 years? Why did you short-sight yourself? It's always weird when they make that decision, but
it is.
It's better in hindsight for us, anyways, to enjoy how wrong.
As we all remember, back in 1994, when the world was run by a disco organization called the BIM.
That's right.
And everything is hedonistic, and a lot of flashy colors and sparkles and drugs and rock and roll. And along come these two folk singers from Moose Jaw, Canada, named Alfie and BB, that are implied to be, I guess, the new Adam and Eve. It's never completely clear who's
nothing in the movie is fucking completely clear.
No, never at any point. But they come along and they have a hit with a folk song that is a love song that completely throws sand in the face of this disco organization, and they want to know who's kicking their ass in this Eurovision style competition for global dominance. And
makes sense.
And so Mr. Boogaloo gets quickly to work releasing his minions Dandy and Pandy, who were a disco singing duo, to seduce Alfie and BB, and it works. Dandy is able to seduce BB and take her away from Alfie, and she becomes the next big Boogaloo music superstar. And Alfie runs off to basically drink himself to death in a small hovel. and continue to write his folk music and imagine how he's going to get BB back. And there's really no way. I'm not going to try to sum up the ending for you. You'll just have to see it to see whether he gets BB back. It's a pretty incredible struggle to do so. The music is catchy, but earwormy as hell, and none of it really says anything. They're not really connected. There's literally a song about slavery that's sung by black people, which is really not the message that I don't think that's what they were trying to convey. I take it back. I think they were trying to be funny, but they weren't realizing that wasn't funny. And the look on the faces of the actors singing it looked like they were not particularly pleased, but Menahem Golan was probably laughing hysterically at himself. I discovered this movie about 15 years ago or so. It played in New York City when I was living out there. And a couple of friends and I went out to go see it. It was playing over, I can't remember if it was Memorial Day or Labor Day weekend, but it was a 3-day weekend. And so the midnight movies were showing on Friday, Saturday, and Sunday of that week. So they were playing the Apple for all 3 days. And as each night went on, we were pulling a larger and larger group of friends to come back to see it with us. And all of us walking away, just loving it more and more. And I was actually part of a group. We didn't pick this name, but we were eventually called the Apple Superfans by the Brooklyn Academy of Music. The Brooklyn Academy of Music had their own showing of the Apple about 6 months later. And they invited us to come and present it because they considered us to be the ones who had kind of gotten it something of a reputation in New York. And of course, in LA, the same thing was happening at the New Art. And I flew back to visit my family and to visit you and your family. And that was when I talked you into going out to the New Art with me. I believe you were on that trip, right? To the New Art?
Yeah, it was it just me and you? Or no, I thought it was...
No, there was a whole group of us.
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. Yeah.
And I brought BIM marks and everything from New York. We had made, my friend had made BIM marks. And I got to the New Art Theater thinking, oh, everyone's going to be so jealous of my BIM marks. And of course, the people of the New Art had the same idea because it's a dumb idea. It's a sticker.
Yeah, but it's still cool. I do remember not remembering much of that night for various reasons, but yes. I do remember being like, it's one of those rare moments. It was the first time I saw Big Lebowski where I was literally felt like it was changing me, where I was like a different person afterwards. It was almost like a religious experience. It's one of those movies that like I don't know how isn't more well known. Movies like The Room, it's like those become famous, but like to me, it's like I get the appeal, I guess. But something like The Apple is infinitely more entertaining for multiple reasons. And yet it still doesn't have the same, reputation, still doesn't have the same, cachet or whatever.
Well, some people downright hate it.
Oh, yeah. Yes. In fact, I've tried to get people to watch it, and they hated it, which breaks my heart. And
if you love this movie or you hate this movie, you're not exactly wrong. I think that's...
No, and that's fair. I mean, the thing is, like I said, I don't believe in liking something for ironic reasons. It's not like, oh, it's so bad, I love it. I mean, it's usually like, yeah, it's bad, but there's so much heart or originality or there's so much fun. Like they were having a good time. Like I like things despite sometimes their flaws, but not necessarily because of the flaws. And that's a movie that it's goofy and it's weird as shit. But you can tell they were trying to do something.
They were giving it 110%. Everybody in that movie was pouring their soul, except for that one song.
But it was the other thing is too, it was sort of like a Bugsy Berkeley, like Busby, I can never speaking words, but like a big Busby Berkeley musical. Like the dance sequences and musical numbers felt really they felt expensive, they felt big, they were really interesting. The set design, everything was really cool. So I appreciate all that.
It has a lot of production value.
Yeah, it does, and it looked like a much better film than it had a right to look. But it's
I believe it was Nigel. I don't know his last name. Nigel from one of those dance shows. So You Think You Can Dance.
I don't watch any of those shows, but
my wife watches it, so I know that there's a guy named Nigel, and I found out only recently that he was the one who choreographed The Apple. So,
that's awesome. That's rad.
Cool. And now he judges dancers on TV.
There you go. So obviously we could talk about. I mean, there's a ton of early can't release horror stuff. New Year's Evil, which I mean is only really relevant because everybody watches it. every New Year. It's like my social media, just like, oh, it's New Year's Eve. Everybody's going to be posting about New Year, which is always what my social media does.
Tarantino showed it at the New Beverly at midnight on New Year's, and it's kind of
the one thing I will give credit for that movie though is horror was one of the first. Horror's always been a medium that was more aware of what was going on in contemporary society, while the rest of the world ignored the punk rock scene. Horror would embrace it, and sometimes for the wrong reasons or in a really silly way. But New Year's Evil had a pretty authentic feeling, punk and early new wave scene, and it's in hindsight sometimes you're like, oh well, they missed the mark here and there, but it honestly for a film in 1980, they were portraying punk as a pretty relevant, real thing, and not necessarily as this stupid fad, like the way a lot of films would portray, especially mainstream films. They didn't get it wrong. Is it a great movie? No, but it's fun. I enjoy it. There's also Alien Contamination, which is, again, it's not the best movie. It's a fun film. Very low budget special effects, and it's not a great film, but I do enjoy it. One of the movies though that I haven't seen in the early thing that I'm surprised I hadn't seen yet going through it, because I've seen a lot of his work, but it's 10 to Midnight, and I was wondering if you'd actually seen 10 to Midnight.
God, I have. It's been forever. I so almost watched it again before this, but I'll tell you what it came down to. They did so many Charles Bronson movies. I was trying to pick which ones I wanted to see.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot popping up on this list. Yeah.
And but of the non-Death Wish movies, it really came down to 10 to Midnight or Murphy's Law that I wanted to watch. And Murphy's Law I had a subscription rental to, and 10 to Midnight I would have had to have rented it from Amazon. So I went with the one that was already on a subscription service, which was Murphy's Law.
There you go.
Which was fun.
I do want to see it though.
I kind of wish I had seen 10 to Midnight.
Really? Yeah. I haven't seen Murphy's Law either, so. So, obviously going in, I think one of the films we need to talk about, because it was one of the first big mainstream hits that they had, and sort of, first we can talk about the Emmanuelle movies, because those were important to me as a young man for different reasons.
Yeah, I think Canon may have kept Cinemax going in the early years.
Yes, absolutely. Oh, by the way, a movie I did want to talk about, which I actually own on bootleg DVD. It's like it must have been taped off of VHS. It is a terrible low quality. Is the movie Young Warriors, or also I think it's got another title. It's also known as The Graduates of Malibu High, which is a terrible name, but Young Warriors is cooler. It's this really goofy action film with a really interesting cast. It actually has James Van Patten, Ernest Borgnine, because of course it does, and Richard Roundtree in it. It's very goofy. It's very much of the time. It's another rape revenge movie. This girl gets raped and killed by these bikers, and then her brother basically wants to become a vigilante. Him and the dudes from his fraternity, and it's basically just like another rape revenge vigilante film. It's got some really cool mid 80s violence, and but it's a dumb movie, but it's fun. It's definitely I bought it. I went to some convention, and this guy who had all these out of print films, like just crazy shit, and I just bought a bunch of sight unseen, and that one I watched, and it was fun. Like I said, it's not a great movie, but it's very fun. Like I said, it's got a really interesting cast. But the movie I want to talk about next, because again, it was a huge breakout hit for them, is the movie Breakin'. We talked earlier about how the punk rock scene, but obviously the breakdance scene and the hip hop scene in New York and stuff. In New York was sort of the birthplace of it, even though these films take place in Los Angeles. But Breakin' was a huge thing. It was, I think, probably pretty regular mainstay on cable TV at the time. But it was a big deal. It became a cultural touchstone, and it's still popular to this day. Usually as as a cheap joke, or as the punchline of a joke, especially Breakin' 2, Electric Boogaloo, which we'll also include on this. I actually love the films. I rewatched both of them recently. They're fun, man. And they actually they're very rewatchable. I love the music in it. I really love Breakin'. The dancing is obviously great. They have two real dancers, and one of the greatest street names ever, Boogaloo Shrimp. He was there's actually a documentary about that man, about the young guy. Well, he's not a young man anymore, but about the dancer / actor Boogaloo Shrimp and how important he was. The fact that he sort of doesn't get credit because he came up with he basically did a bunch of choreography for Michael Jackson that he never got credit for. It's a really interesting documentary. But yeah, Breakin', Devin, I'm assuming you've seen the Breakin' films.
I have seen Breakin' 1 and Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo for sure. Grew up on them. Was definitely, as a white kid in the suburbs, probably my first exposure to hip hop at all.
Yeah, I would say the same.
And my first exposure to breakdancing outside of, I'm sure there was a Pepsi commercial somewhere along the way or something that had it before I saw Breakin', but was my first exposure to that world for how unrealistic the world itself was in the movie. And of course they brought in, what's her name? She was also Ninja 3.
Yes. Yes, I was going to talk. Yes, she was very attractive. She's very cute. I had a giant crush on her. I think it was like her and Soleil Moon Frye were, I think, two of the first real crushes I had. But yeah, they're fun movies. Weirdly enough, it was actually, I don't know, I should have done research, but I just just remembered. But I think it's the first one, but it could be the second one, is the first film appearance of Jean-Claude Van Damme and his buddy who's, they're just basically dancing. Yes, of course. In fact, Devin, I'll just bring this up right now. One of the things I found when I was cleaning, and I bought this with you and your dad, is my Van Damme nesting doll, the Russian nesting doll, but of Jean-Claude Van Damme, and it's sitting proudly. It's literally one of my favorite belongings. It's got a nice hard target Jean-Claude as the big nesting doll. But yeah, I bought that with you in New York. I think it was the first purchase I made in New York and the best thing I bought all week. It now has a proud spot on my desk, so I just thought I'd share that. And he will obviously come up. They were very important in his career, so we'll definitely get to some Jean-Claude in a second. But yeah, anyways, Breakin' was a great film. Breakin' 2, very fun. I rewatched Breakin' 2 just for Ice-T's performance because how far he's come.
Yes, Ice-T's first film performance.
That's right.
Did you know there was a third one? Lucinda Dickey, by the way, was the name of the actress we were trying to think of.
There we go. Yeah,
she was kind of the canon queen there for a little while between these two movies and Ninja 3: The Domination. There was a third one that was never really intended to be the third one, but obviously an offshoot of it. In the United States, it came out as Rappin' with Melvin Van Peebles.
Yeah, that's right. Yes.
And I only bring it up. It's not a great movie. It didn't really affect hip hop in the same way that Breakin' affected breakdancing. The only reason I bring it up is for this side note. The Breakin' movies in the UK were called Breakdance. Breakdance 1, Breakdance 2, Electric Boogaloo, and this one was Breakdance 3, Electric Boogalee in the UK.
Oh my God! Okay, I never heard that. I do remember Rappin' though.
I don't know whether I love or I hate that they actually went that direction.
I don't know. That's amazing. I love that every time we do this, I learn something, not only something new, but something ludicrous. I can't believe I'd never heard. One movie I do want to talk about just very briefly, because I do want to save it for a different podcast, is Exterminator 2. I am a giant fan of the 70s and early to mid 80s vigilante films. It's a whole subgenre that I feel like that we definitely need to do as a podcast because I have a lot to say. But Exterminator 2, very much a kind of, I don't know if I like the original Exterminator better, but the first Exterminator felt like more of a legitimate movie. But I will say it's still one of the greatest VHS covers of all time. But yeah, I wanted to talk about it, but I do want to go more in depth into it when we talk about vigilante movies because I'll have a lot to say. But we obviously we'll briefly mention Ninja 3: The Domination. It's a movie I saw as a kid, and then I was actually really excited because I'd been wanting to rewatch it, and then Scream Factory put it out a few years ago. I was like, fuck yes, because I remember as a kid thinking the movie was pretty cool, and obviously, like I said, Lucinda Dickey was very cute. God, what a weird fucking movie.
Yeah, bizarre.
It's such a departure from the other films.
It's not like anything else. It's a ninja movie with an exorcism in it. I mean, what else can you say but that?
Yeah. and the spirit of an evil ninja possesses this young white girl. It's very weird, but it's like definitely a fun watch. Probably not for everybody.
I really enjoy it, but it's not because it's a great movie by any stretch.
No, absolutely not. But it's a fun time. Another movie that we'll definitely talk about because we brought up his name. That really sorry that I'm sort of kind of like going through this quickly, but we just have a lot to talk about. But it's very important. It was a movie that was super important in my household. Is Missing in Action. Canon Group was they were really vital in a lot of these young American action film careers. They were really important, obviously, to Chuck Norris's career and then obviously Jean-Claude Van Damme. I don't really love Missing in Action. Of the Chuck Norris films, I'll talk about one of my favorites later, but the wartime Chuck Norris films, I'm not as big of a fan of, but my mother was a giant fan of it. She watched Missing in Action all the time. My mom had a giant crush on Chuck Norris, but definitely is important because, a pretty successful film, and like I said, really started kicking off the career. I mean, obviously Chuck Norris had a career before this. He actually had a lot of films before 1984, but this was like they weren't as successful. Like, and again, this was the advent of VHS, so that was giving Chuck Norris like his real career. But yeah, so I've mentioned a lot. Is there any specific movie you want to talk about in this 83, 84 era?
There's some things worthy of mentioning in the Missing in Action films.
Sure, let's talk about it.
Well, Chuck Norris was a big star of the period, and at the time they would joke around at Canon. They had the two Chucks. They had Chuck Norris and Charles Bronson, and I kind of find it interesting. I feel like about the best Chuck Norris stuff was done by Canon, and about the worst Charles Bronson stuff was done by Canon. Like, one, they made a star, and the other one, they killed his star.
Well, yeah, because that's also, because at this point, like I said, Chuck really was starting, like, he had obviously films going back into the 70s, but 80s was really where he became like a household name.
Yeah.
Where Charles Bronson was already a household name, by the early 80s, and now is starting to sort of have the twilight of his career a little bit. So it's kind of understandable.
I have a genuine soft spot for Death Wish 3, which I shouldn't have because it's a ridiculous movie. It's
how dare you,
so
sir?
Problematic.
It's one of the greatest films.
God, yeah, I love it. Well, that's the thing. Almost like every Canon film has something problematic. Some of them are extremely problematic. Death Wish 3 doesn't even come close to being the most problematic Canon film.
No.
But I will say I have an affection for Death Wish 3. But outside of Death Wish 3, I don't think that Canon made even anything in the top 10 of Charles Bronson's career.
Well, they did Death Wish 2, but I mean...
I'm not as big... I get
it's my third favorite.
Yeah.
For me, it goes Death Wish 3, Death Wish 2. And then, again, we've talked before, I actually like all the Death Wish films, but they're definitely not of equal quality. But
I like Michael Parks in part 5, at least. He was good in part 5, at least. Michael Parks.
Yes. Yep. He's the best villain. He's the coolest, dude. Yeah, of course, it's Michael Parks. In fact, I was just literally having a conversation like 3 or 4 days ago with some coworkers about how I do not understand how that guy didn't have a bigger film career. Because even when he's in completely, obscure films or films that are shitty, he's always been great, which is, one thing I'll give Tarantino is that, he at least gave the dude something to do in the end of his career that actually, put him on some people's spotlight. But he was he might be in my top 10 favorite actors of all time just because he's never he's been in shitty movies. We'll say like Death Wish 5, but he's great in it. So,
exactly.
Michael Parks, God bless you. One thing though I did want to say is that Missing in Action came out in November of 84, and then Missing in Action 2 came out in March of 85. So they were pushing these films out quick. Even as a kid, I think...
Do you know the reason they came out that close and in the order they came out?
I do not, but that's what you're here for, Devin.
Well, they made Missing in Action 1 and 2 back to back. What had happened was Stallone, who will come up in this story again later on, because Stallone definitely has some historical moments with Canon films as well. But prior to him ever working with Canon, he brought Rambo 2 to Canon, and Canon passed on it because they couldn't meet Stallone's budget for it. But the trick was they got to see the script, the original script by James Cameron. And they took elements of that script and said, we're going to make a movie and we're going to get it out before Rambo First Blood Part 2. We're going to beat Stallone to this movie. And so they decided they're going to make 1 and 2 back to back. And with 1 being the one in the concentration, with 1 being in the POW camp, and then the second one being him going back to Vietnam to get prisoners who had not yet been released.
Yeah.
And then the third one's kind of a disconnected one of its own as well, but also with Colonel Braddock. Joseph Zito, I can't remember who directed the quote-unquote first one, but Joseph Zito directed the sequel, and a very capable director who also did some other stuff for Canon. But outside of Canon, he also did Friday the 13th Part 4, Final Chapter, which most people, probably including myself, consider to be the best of the Friday the 13th series.
Not even up for debate. If anybody says otherwise, they're... I'm not going to be rude, but yes, it's Friday the 13th Chapter 4, or the Final Chapter is I would actually say I think of the mid-career of all of, like, whether it's the Friday the 13th, the Nightmare on Elm Streets, whatever. I think it sums up everything fun about slashers of that period perfectly, and it has a full character arc, and it's still the coolest thing that Corey Haim's ever done. And Corey Haim has done, Corey Feldman. And Corey Feldman's done a lot of cool shit, despite whatever you want to say about Feldman.
It's true.
He's done a lot of really great films, but I still think this is like my favorite thing he's ever done. And yeah, anyways, we could talk about that all day. But yes, I absolutely agree with you. He's done a lot of cool films too.
So Joseph Zito directed
Part 2,
Missing in Action Part 2. And so then the two, Golan and Globus, took a look at these two films and realized, oh shit, the second one is so much better than the first one that if we release the first one first, nobody's going to go see the second one and we'll have wasted all this money. So they flipped it. They released Part 2 as Missing in Action, and they released Part 1 as Missing in Action Part 2, The Beginning.
Yeah.
So, yes. So it wasn't like they decided later, oh, let's do a prequel film where we get to see Braddock actually in his POW camp. This was literally a matter of, it was the secondary film to a superior
that's interesting,
sequel.
Yeah. No, the third one's actually called Braddock, isn't it?
Just like Rambo First Blood Part 2, you have Braddock Missing in Action Part 3. And that one I haven't seen since Cinemax. The other two Missing in Action, I won't even say Mission Impossible. The other Missing in Action films, the first two I did rewatch because of learning about the consecutive filming. So I do have these films pretty solid in the back of my head, and they are pretty good. The other thing I will say that is totally a personal thing and not really connected to canon at all, but my wife and I are currently binge watching the TV show Shameless from Showtime. And every time now I look at Chuck Norris while at the same time as binge watching Shameless, I see William H. Macy. They have the same haircut and beard.
That's right.
And so,
that's very true.
It just, there's no way to compare them otherwise. Frank Gallagher from Shameless was never in any war for any man besides himself. Yeah. What a great character. Maybe. Yeah, exactly. Such a great show. But yeah, it's made me giggle a couple of times to see the similarities between those two actors physically.
So one movie that we'll just mention briefly is The Company of Wolves, just because it stands out in their catalog as being something unique for them. We've already talked about it in our werewolf episode, but it's a very interesting movie, definitely worth watching. But the movie I want to talk about real quick is Life Force, Dan O'Bannon film. This like sci-fi horror-ish, kind of a weird like space horror.
Originally titled Space Vampires, which would have, I think, been
Space Vamp. That's right.
Much more suitable title.
Yeah, sounds very much like a AIP, the film. I think people know it really well these days. I think for like the special effects of it, but I really enjoy the movie. I love everything about it. I think it's Dan O'Bannon, is one of the most underrated, screenwriters and also directors. But his writing is like really. I love it. I love both the films he's directed in. But so a really great movie with really great special effects. Definitely the film still I think the special effects and the all this the picture design stuff, all the film design stuff still holds up. I think it's still cool.
Yeah, the effects still work.
Effects. Yeah, and it's a fun little movie. It's not in the same league as something like Alien or Blade Runner or anything, but it's solid, good sci-fi horror. And again, you're right. Space Vampires is much more of a even though Life Force is a great title and actually really accurate to what's kind of going on. It makes sense, but
yeah, these vampires they suck the life force out of their victims rather than sucking the blood. The blood, victims. Yeah. But it's essentially the same thing. And I think the conceit, if I remember correctly, the conceit of the film is that these space vampires have been on Earth before and were maybe even the origin source of the mythology of the vampire.
Vampires, yes.
So
correct.
vampires exist as a mythology because early humans had to deal with these space vampires that sucked out the life force. And some of the prosthetics are so good. Some of the prosthetics used in this movie also wound up in the 1999 version of The Mummy. So they were still standing up.
I did not know that.
Yeah, we're talking, it's got to be 10, 12, 13 years later.
15 years, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. And
that's crazy.
And you didn't mention Tobe Hooper directed it.
That's right. Yes, that's right.
First of a 3-picture deal he had with him. Let's go ahead and, because I know we're going to talk about at least one of the other ones. So let's maybe go down that direction, because he followed up Life Force with Invaders from Mars, which is a fun little film. It's a remake.
It's a fun movie,
50s movie, and it's got a lot of nods to the original movie. The kid from the original movie is actually a cop in the new one. If you blink and you miss it, but when they're looking around in the basement of the school, you can actually see one of the original 50s aliens is in the basement of the school.
Yeah, that's all right.
And it's about a kid who thinks he sees a UFO land, and then the adults around him start acting weird. It's almost like a child's version of Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
Yeah.
And I just found this out recently. The kid is actually the son of Karen Black, who is also in the movie.
I did not know that.
She's the protector of the boy in this movie as the school nurse, but not as the mother. The mother's actually played by Lorraine Newman, who I think was a bit of a tongue-in-cheek choice. I think they picked Lorraine Newman because she was one of the original Coneheads, and now they're debating whether she's an actual alien. And it's a fun movie. It's the least of the Tobe Hooper directed canon films. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump into the third one, which he was basically contractually obligated to deliver them after more than a decade, Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2, which is one of the most controversial horror films, even amongst horror fans, as to whether or not this is a good film or a valid part of canon, or not just canon, but Texas Chainsaw Massacre canon.
Film canon, or exactly. Now, I will say, I do get, it is such a departure from the original, but I think that's why it's successful. In fact, I almost wore my KOLA radio station hat tonight. I love everything about Part 2. I love the introduction of Chop Top. I love the movie's hysterical. The movie looks fantastic. That's the one thing, as much as I love the aesthetic of the original Friday the 13th and the fact that it was almost like watching a documentary, it felt very real. This is very polished, very, slick looking, but I think it's amazing. I think all of the cinematography in it is just perfect for what they're trying to do with it. The movie's fucking amazing. I love it. I think it's hysterical. I think it's so much fun. I think, again, the part of my brain with names, but what is her name? Damn it,
Stretch,
this is bothering me.
Carolyn
Stretch,
Williams?
thank you. Stretch. I think she's such a great protagonist, one of the two protagonists. I think it might be my second favorite Dennis Hopper performance of all time, right after Blue Velvet. It's got chainsaw fights. It's so over the top and so much fun. It's so stupid, but in the best way possible. I love it. I know why people don't. I think at this day and age, people I know in the, at the time in the 80s and the early 90s, diehard, horror fans hated it because it's such a departure. But I think now it's become much like, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch. I think horror fans have come full circle on it. They used to hate it. Now they sort of appreciate it for what it is. And I like Leatherface is I wish I just recently rewatched Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 3. I think is cool. And I think it definitely has more of it's kind of a weird balance of both, but it definitely a little bit more, in the tone of the first one. But I love Part 2. I love everything about it. I love the soundtrack and the score. I love the performances. Like I said, I think Chop Top was a great addition. So I like the fact that what went from very realistic Texas country home has now turned into some sort of weird underground fucking I don't even know, amusement park. Yeah, but watch the movie just for Dennis Hopper alone, and you will have the best time there. So,
it's fantastic. The colors in it, the sounds, it's a complete film. I understand why people are pissed. I can say from where I stand, when I saw this movie, I was young enough that I watched Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and then I went back to the video store and I got Texas Chainsaw Massacre Part 2. I don't know that I would have had the same feelings about it had I had to wait 10 years between films.
Yeah, for real.
But waiting one night between films, I thought it was a perfect escalation of ridiculousness. And I do think artistically it does hold on its own. Tobe Hooper has said himself that he considered Texas Chainsaw Massacre, the first, to be a funnier film than people made it out to be. Which it is. If you're a fan, you can look at it and see where he's going with that. I don't think that's the reaction that first-time viewers and especially non-horror viewers will have for it. But I feel like in the second one, he was delivering like, okay, if you didn't get the jokes in the first one, let me put it really in your face for the second one. And I think there was maybe even a little bit of protest there, like the Golan and Globus wanted a Chainsaw Massacre sequel so bad. And Hooper had now worked with him on 2 other movies, and I think was at a point where he was just like, you know what, you want a sequel? Here's your fucking sequel. And they hated it. Golan and Globus hated this, apparently. And they did end up working with Hooper again years later when, like, after Cannon had gone away, but Golan and Globus worked with him again on something called Night Terrors. But there was like a several-year gap between pictures there, and I think it was a falling out over this movie. But I think it's an artistically relevant film. It's creepy, it's weird. Like you said, Chop Top is funny and frightening at the same time. The scene where he shows
creepy
up
as all hell, yeah.
He shows up in a radio station in like a hippie outfit.
Yeah, with his Beatles wig, and it's like, yeah.
And we all know that this guy's bent. But the character who's dealing with him, she just gets the feeling that he's bent. And there's a really good sort of build up. And you don't know where Leatherface is while this whole build-up is growing and growing. You know, Leatherface has got to be around there somewhere. And you're starting to get the feeling that this guy might not even need Leatherface. Maybe this guy's going to go after. Perfect performance by Bill Moseley, leading obviously to him getting all the Rob Zombie work a few years down the line. I would say that Chop Top is definitely like the spiritual older brother to Otis Firefly.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And which produced at least one other great movie and one pretty good movie and one horrible piece of shit. But
so I can't even talk about it.
It's going to be interesting to see what Rob Zombie's legacy is, 20 years from now.
I'll say it to the day I die. I do think he's a really strong director and he's a great visual storyteller, but he should have been working with a writer. He's fucking ego. He should have checked his ego and realized that he's not a great writer. All of his fucking characters sound exactly the same. And he should have worked with a writer who actually understands how to tell a story. But either way, one movie I do want to talk about very quickly. First off, we have American Ninja, which we've talked about, the first of a franchise. But I do want to really quickly talk about a movie they released in 1985 called Hard Rock Zombies. Another subgenre of movies I am a diehard fan of is the heavy metal horror subgenre, which there was a lot in the 80s. This movie is a lesser. I mean, there's ones that are like actually really well done, for what they are. Movies like the original Trick or Treat, not Trick or Treat, the original Trick or Treat, Black Roses. There's some really good ones, but this is not one of them. In fact, I didn't know until I was looking at the list of the films they released that this was released by Cannon. It seems low budget and low quality even for Cannon films, especially for this period. It's a terrible movie, but it's fun and stupid. It's basically like, have you ever seen it, Devin?
No, but I knew it was going to come up because I know you.
Yeah, okay. But yeah, it's not a good movie. All the acting throughout it is submoronic, but it's a very fun movie. It's exactly what it sounds like. It's if you're into, like, if you have never seen it but you like movies like Hack-O-Lantern or like I said, the original Trick or Treat, which is a fantastic movie, or Black Roses, it's definitely worth a fun watch. Even the music in it's bad, but in a way that's fun and works for it. But obviously, so we talked about Missing in Action and that film franchise. But the one I really want to talk about is hands down my favorite Chuck Norris movie. Even though I'm a fan of like Hero and Terror and even some other movies that will come up, I still think Invasion USA is his best movie. I think it's everything that he did cool in one movie. The opening sequence of like things happen, or like certain sequences in film like really stay with you and affect you. Weirdly, this movie is one of the scenes that affected me really deeply as a kid. And like, I would think about even occasionally, separate of the movie, it's when, you see this quiet suburban street. It's like Christmas Eve and you see all the beautiful decorations and it's, there's this peaceful like feeling. And then all of a sudden you see all these like basically these terrorists roll up and you see this, and I'm forgetting the actor's name, but he's perfect in this as like the head of this like terrorist organization. But you know, they start like bazooking these suburban homes on Christmas Eve and like killing people. And as a kid, it was the scare. Like there's like the sanctity of Christmas. It's like so like you don't fuck with Christmas. It's like it's you know, and it felt like a betrayal of everything I trusted. And it really honestly freaked me out. Like I would think about that, like laying in bed being like, God, I hope nobody bazookas my home. But yeah, it's a great movie. Yeah, and it's you know it's such a great you know sequence to really make you hate these terrorists. I mean, but you know, for some reason, for as long as I live, I will always associate Chuck Norris with sleeveless denim button-up shirts and in those old like fan boats and swamps. I mean, there's so much
strapped
about this movie
his
that
double Uzi.
That's right, which is still the coolest look ever. But I mean, this movie's like got all these amazing action sequences, lots of great action. It's hands down my favorite Chuck movie, and again, it was a movie my mom loved as well.
It was Joseph Zito again too, by the way.
That's right. That's what I said when you were saying like, yeah, exactly. And I think there's something about 80s era action films which are the most like these days, not to be like harp on modern films, but these days like nobody understands how to edit an action film. I mean, thanks to movies like Matrix and stuff where you know, which we're trying to do something new and different, which is cool and stuff. But like we've had all these like fast edits, like nothing stays on the action. It's always quick edits. This film, like all the action sequences are great because they keep the camera lingers. There are a lot of medium shots, a lot of wide shots that let the action play out. It's you have a lot of cars flipping and explosions, all the traditional stuff, but the action feels like very like impressive because of the way that the film is edited and the way the film is shot. And I missed that. I missed the era of American action films. But anyways, yeah, it's hands down my favorite Chuck Norris movie. Do you have any specific thoughts on Invasion USA?
It's a lot of fun. Richard Lynch, by the name, is the name of the villain.
The actor.
Yeah. And you may not know him by name, you would know him by face.
Yes.
Most people. If you were around in the 80s, you've seen Richard Lynch. The only other thing that pops into my head right now is that he was Brubaker with Robert Redford, but he's definitely a that guy from the period. I mean, I think you pretty much summed it up. I do think that it's Chuck Norris's best movie. To say it's his best work is maybe to almost give too much credit to Chuck Norris's talent as a performer. He's pretty much showing up to be Chuck Norris in anything he does.
Yes.
And there's actually a couple other movies by Cannon where he tries to do something a little different, and I think he kind of charmingly fails at being funnier. But that wasn't this movie. In this movie, he knew that he had to do this seriously, and apparently this was kind of his brainchild because he had read a report or seen something, documentary or something, discussing terrorists living in the United States. He had this idea of, what if they attacked our cities, on Christmas Eve? It is a frightening thought. It's definitely a reactionary thought, but it is frightening. And especially, like you said, as a kid growing up, seeing this, neighborhood blown up, they were able to film in an actual suburban neighborhood that was going to be bulldozed shortly after anyways. So they were allowed to bring firepower in and destroy these houses.
Too.
Yeah, those weren't sets. Those were actual houses in a neighborhood.
Yeah, because they looked, and again, that's why I said the action is so impressive. One of the reasons, apparently, because they were really blowing up houses.
Up suburban houses. And then they similarly lucked into finding a mall that was going to be refurbished as well, which, again, Christmas time at the mall, the terrorists take over and start shooting up Santa and the kids. And again, it's terrifying but exciting. And, you see that there's going to be a big giveaway for a pickup truck, and that at some point someone's going to drive that pickup truck outside of the mall. Some of the most ridiculous set pieces with that truck specifically, people hanging off the side of it and whatever. But again, so much fun for all of its issues. It is a really fun movie, and it's capably directed by Joseph Zito, who I do think was one of the better directors that continued to work for Cannon. There were some
absolutely, I agree, 100%.
Huge directors who came and visited Cannon, so to speak. We can go over them maybe in a little bit. I'm actually looking at the time and then looking at the list of films that I feel like we have to watch or that we have to talk about. And
we might need to do a part 2, huh?
God damn us. I swear to God, this was not planned. This was so not intended to be a 2-part.
That's what I said. And we're skipping a lot of films. We're
taking huge leaps.
There's still Yeah, but there's still a lot we need to talk about, and some huge ones for me personally. So
same
I think
here.
let's call it there. Well, yeah, let's call it there, and then we'll release part 2. Hopefully not part 3. We'll have to do this quicker.
Let's not do that. Yeah, I will promise you too. By the way, I will watch Charles Bronson in 10 to midnight between now and then, and we'll talk.
I'm gonna watch it too.
All right, cool.
Like I said, I've always wanted to see it. I picture the film poster this day, but it's got a cool premise. Like the plot sounds cool. Sounds like something I love. So we'll both watch it. And we'll revisit.
Yeah,
but this is really fun. This is really fun. This is definitely in my wheelhouse of my soft spot for film. So this has been a lot. And I mean, again, I learn something every single time we do this. But tonight's no exception. But yeah, I'm excited. We still have a lot to talk about.
Yeah, some of the more exciting stuff we've got coming up.
Oh yeah, no, we have not touched upon some of my favorites. We will get to though. But yeah, Devin, this was super fun. I look forward to the next one.
All right, me too.
All right, listeners. Well, hopefully you enjoyed this as much as we enjoyed making it, and look out for part 2 coming soon, I guess.
Look out for Canon Films Den of Sin podcast part 2, Electric Boogaloo.
Electric Boogaloo, perfect. I can't believe I didn't think of that. Just as long as there's no part 3 Electric Boogaloo.
Let's please not. No.
Yeah, totally.
But I think I would have actually been in trouble with the dad joke police if I hadn't have made that joke. So
absolutely, yeah, it's required.
All right, man. I will talk to you next time.
All right, guys. Peace out.